I'm originally from Liverpool. I moved to Glasgow when I was 12, just as I started S1. So I did all my primary education in Liverpool, and then obviously my secondary and all my higher stuff here in Glasgow. When I think back to my schooling days, I would say they were happy times. I enjoyed school. I, took part in everything. But if I think more deeply, I really think what happens a lot of the time with ethnic minority youngsters is being in that kind of minority. And also when you are part of an environment that doesn't really talk much about your background and the differences, let's say, that you bring, you very quickly get used to that. So you very quickly, develop this kind of dual identity. So there's the you in school, and you take part in everything, and you're enthusiastic, and your teachers love you, and you love your teachers, and everything's fine. But then you also have your home identity and your social identity outside of school. And I think that experience, is very common. I would say that, the people then that you meet in school, you don't end up socializing with as much outside, because that's where the kind of cultural differences come in, and you end up having that separate circle. So, and also I think that because you begin to get used to that experience as you're growing up and you're going through all the stages, I think a lot of the time you don't notice the kind of microaggressions that might exist, but you always feel different. So even though my own primary school, from what I remember, was fairly diverse, I remember doing a presentation to the whole class on the 5 pillars of Islam, and that being really appreciated. And now I think back to that particular teacher, and I think, well, good for him. He gave me that space to use that topic and encouraged it, and so that's great. But when I think about going through secondary school, by which time I was in Glasgow, yeah, I think that's when you start to feel that, obviously you're a teenager and you're going through all these changes, and you're always questioning your identity as well, of, who am I, what am I, why do I do this, why do I not do that? And I was conscious at that stage. I remember, obviously it's traditional to wear henna, for example, in Asian households, Arabic households as well, especially on Eid, and we've got Eid upcoming soon in a couple of weeks. But when I was a teenager going to school in Glasgow, the first time I wore henna around Eid time, lots of the other kids said to me, what's that? Is that a disease? Is there something wrong with your hands? And that was the first time I had that experience, and I thought, all right, so then I stopped wearing henna altogether for years, just so that people wouldn't kind of say, oh, there's something wrong with your skin. And as it happens, I think it became fashionable after Madonna used it in one of her videos, if you remember. I think it was Frozen or something it was called, back in the late 90s then, and all of a sudden, oh, it's now fashionable. And I thought, great, I can break the henna out again. So that's a shame. And I have to admit, I'm glad that that is now not the case. But it's a shame that it had to take someone like Madonna to change that, but it wasn't acceptable enough earlier on. And I memean, going through uni and stuff, and again, I think I formed that kind of barrier, I guess, of this is me outside the house, and, and I'm, I was happy. I don't think I had any really overt racist experiences within my education system. But yeah, I can think of lots of examples where I would have liked to have learned about certain things, that maybe would have represented my background more, that would have valued my culture more. And it was very much non-existent in that sense. And obviously that is what is now driving me in the work that I do just now. I'll leave it there, Kevin. I hope that's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And an unexpected early Madonna reference in the discussion as well. Thank you very much. That's a really interesting starting point. And I think that idea of identity and dual identity is something I'm sure we're going to come back to in lots of our discussions as well. Elizabeth, can we come to you next? What was your experience of school as a pupil like?
So I did go to school in Scotland, but prior to that I was born in the Philippines. I'm mixed ethnicity, just to kind of give you a context for that. My dad's actually from Cowdenbeath and my mum is from Manila, so it's a bit of a mix. I was born in the Philippines and was raised there until I was 4, so went through a kindergarten phase in the Philippines and then transitioned over to Scotland when I was going into primary 1. So that was kind of a big change, but obviously in your early years, you just go along with it, and we're quite resilient when we're young. And I was schooled in Fife and went through primary school, high school in Fife, and now work in the authority as well. So it's quite interesting for me, having been through the system, and particularly working in the authority now. As a young child, the school that I was in Fife, it's not in like a large built up area in Fife. I was the only child in my class that kind of deviated from the normative whiteness. And especially like in the 90s, it wasn't exactly the most diverse time for rural communities. So for me, to be honest, white was normalised. And even now, as I've done my research, I've come to see like how much that impacts children. I don't work in a hugely diverse community now, and I see the impact of that, and I can relate to that. I think looking back, the biggest thing for me as a child, in hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, is the lack of anonymity that I had as a child. When white is normative and you're something other than that, you're easily identifiable for various things, and you're picked out for various things. It's never, for me, I think I've had the same experience as my colleagues, in that it's never been out of malice, it's never been like overt racism. It's these microaggressions that were mentioned that I still see now in my practice in schools, that you pick up on these experiences. And I think being singled out as somebody who was different than the normative, homogenous community, it is definitely easy to see in my childhood, whether it was from children or teachers. I think larger schools are part of a larger community, and communities and schools serve each other. And schools tend to adopt practices and principles in their communities. I think now we're coming around to a time when schools are seeing their place as a position that they can challenge community identities, they can challenge community ethos. Schools know that it's a two-way street, and actually for schools we can start to challenge that in how we build our curriculum. There's so much work going on around decolonising the curriculum, for example. And I think if that's something that I'd had when I was younger, it wouldn't have been from such a normalised white perspective. The school wouldn't necessarily have been serving the same community today that it was serving back when I was at school. Later in high school, obviously high schools tend to be a little bit more diverse, having been from bigger communities, well, serving a bigger community, taking lots of smaller communities. But again, it wasn't a hugely diverse high school that I went to. It wasn't in a city, like some experiences around Scotland and England. So again, I'm just kind of gotten used to this normalised whiteness around me, just kind of come to see that as the norm. I like this idea of, or I have compassion for the idea of going between two identities, particularly when you're a child, that at home you have this one ethnic identity, and then it's kind of fluid when you go to school, and there are times that you're called upon to share your differences and kind of put in a limelight to celebrate your differences, or used as an example of difference, which isn't always done in a negative way, so I'm not here to bash that at all, but it does happen, and it does again single you out, and it highlights the normative whiteness. So for me, I think understanding my own complex cultural identity is something I'm really passionate about, and hopefully that's something we can work on in schools amongst children and practitioners, just to make the experiences of children who have complex cultural and ethnic identities easier.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Jahan, do you want to go next? How was your school experience as a pupil?
Thank you. Yeah, so I also came through England. I was educated in London, both for primary and secondary schooling. So I actually went to very diverse schools. There was lots of ethnic diversity, both in the student and staff populations of the schools I attended. I'm mixed race myself, so British Jordanian background, and raised as a Muslim. And I did gravitate to my social circle, and still the friends that I'm still in touch with today. all are from different ethnic minority backgrounds, or we have some shared cultural experiences or shared, religious identities. So that just how, that kind of normative, there still was that kind of normative whiteness in the school, especially in secondary school, but then there was that place socially where you would find people like you, and we tended to gravitate towards each other. And although there was great diversity in the schools, again, I don't feel that was really made the most of. There was the only time you were kind of called upon to perhaps talk about your heritage or religion was on certain occasions, like to celebrate Ramadan or Eid, or, and then the rest of the year it was never really mentioned or talked about. So in some ways still feel we're very much at a similar place, and not a lot has changed. And yet, and the other thing that's interesting, and just particularly in light of that horrible story that had come out recently from a school in Hackney of a child that was strip searched and just pulled out of class. That has happened in a borough that is one of the most diverse boroughs in London. And my mum was a deputy in that area about 20 years ago, and talked about, there was, again, this big push. There was anti-racist training. There was this development of culturally responsive pedagogy. And it sounded 20, 30 years ago that real change was happening. And yet here we are. And these kind of things are still amazingly happening in very diverse settings. So I find that aspect of this recent story particularly concerning. And then, at some point in my secondary years, I started wearing a hijab. I was kind of that point where you start to experiment with your identity. And I remember getting lots of questions from the pupils, other fellow students, just, totally innocent and just interested questions. But none of the teachers in my school ever asked me or and I thought maybe, there could have been an opportunity, when I reflect on it now, to perhaps make that a point of conversation or discuss. But I think, again, it was perhaps just a feeling of not really knowing, or maybe just not noticing, or, and it was never really picked up upon by any teachers in the school. And I certainly do remember hearing racist insults and things that were directed at teachers as well while I was in school. And another big change that had happened, and I felt a lot of my friends really struggled with, was after 9/11. I was in secondary school at that time, and I wasn't actually wearing the hijab anymore at that point, but a lot of my friends were targeted, abused, assaulted in the street. And that was a real big noticeable shift. And again, an opportunity, I think, for schools to really, that was such a global event. Everybody was talking about it, and still does, but it never came into the school. There was no discussion of that event in the school that I remember, or no attempt to kind of, have conversations about religion, and just even there was, and I remember in particular my school was so averse to being politics in the school. And I even at that time, I was a real political activist, and just in the run up to the Iraq War, I was putting posters up around the school advertising the big anti-war protest that was going to happen that March 2003, and the posters kept getting ripped down. And then I realized who was doing it was the head teacher of the school. And I said to my politics teacher at the time that then I was doing A-levels, and she said, the head teacher said, we don't bring politics into the school, and they don't want to have any discussion of that issue. So yeah, it's reflecting back, there's not a lot has changed, and that is what's really quite concerning for me as a teacher now too.
That's a really interesting point to pick up on, because I think that relates to what Khadija is asking in the chat as well about, perhaps historically, perhaps still currently, there's a real push that folk don't bring their full selves into school and aren't able to be their full selves. now that you've gone through the experience of being a pupil, within the English system or the Scottish system, and you're now teaching in the Scottish system, do you think that children from minority ethnic communities can bring their whole selves into school? It's really interesting to hear your thoughts about if that's changed since your time from being a pupil in school to being a teacher in school. Elizabeth, have you got any thoughts about that?
I think certainly now, for myself, particularly after doing my master's and myself studying that, I've come to understand my own ethnicity and the role that plays in me as a practitioner. I feel like more recently, since doing the body of research that I did, I'm much more confident about bringing my own ethnic background, my own cultural identity into school, and I feel it's had a positive impact. As a child, that's something that you kind of left at home. I didn't have any other children who were from a diverse background, let alone Filipino like me. So that really kind of wasn't part of it. Even through my initial teacher education, that didn't come into it. But since doing my master's and opening up that dialogue in school and allowing that dialogue to happen with colleagues and facilitating it in hopefully like a non-aggressive way, where people feel confident about having those dialogues. Since we've had children coming into the school from different diverse backgrounds, and particularly another Filipino family where I felt confident about offering to have a dialogue with the family just to make them feel more comfortable, and that kind of opened the floodgates really, and people felt confident about going to the practitioners in the school who do come from different cultural backgrounds or have assets that they can use like other languages, and asking, can you help with this situation? Can you support this family? Can you support this practitioner? So I feel like in my current context, that's something that has only really developed, I'd say, in the last 12 months, since starting that dialogue and feeling that our diverse cultural backgrounds have something to offer. And I know skills like that are being highlighted in the new General Teaching Council standards, in the documentation coming out from Teaching in a Diverse Scotland. We have such a diverse population available. It's obviously not hugely representative of the national population in our teaching workforce, but we are here and we want to help, and we have skills that we can use. So hopefully that's something that can be shared more. It is an asset to come from a culturally diverse background, and there's something that we can definitely offer our communities.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think folk viewing, the offer that folk can bring in and the assets that they bring in with their identity is really important as well. Nuzat, do you want to say anything about how comfortable children feel being themselves at the moment in school?
I think it's a really interesting question, because ultimately a child will feel comfortable if they see someone like themselves in that environment. So the more teachers then that we have from different ethnic minorities, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same one as you as a child, but the fact that there is diversity there within your school team, that people that teach you, the people that give you different perspectives, the people that you can go to for support for various things through your education, if they are people that have an understanding of what it means to not be white in this environment, then that is something that is, I think, a huge support for people, for children, to bring more of that home identity. So absolutely, that representation and the role models there are really important. Also, again, it's about how we show value. So Jahan was saying, about how, we were only asked about certain things at cultural times. So, one of the messages I try to advocate is moving away from these kind of standalone events. So it's okay to celebrate Eid and it's okay to do Diwali and Chinese New Year and stuff, but you can't only speak about different ethnicities in a very narrow cultural, context all the time. It needs to be spread across the curriculum and across through all the kind of teaching and learning experiences that they have. And just listening to actually Elizabeth and Jahan, I wondered, I'm going to throw in a question here, Kevin. I just had a thought, that would it be fair to say that when you're mixed heritage, do you think that there is a tendency in the system to kind of focus more on your whiteness because that is more familiar, and therefore it ignores the other aspect of your kind of heritage, and so therefore you're still kind of having even more of an identity crisis, I guess? Would that be fair to say?
I think that's a really relevant point. Definitely. I think also if you're mixed heritage, I don't know if anybody else who's mixed heritage here would agree, but you kind of don't fit in either box. you're in this middle box. And even at the point in working for an authority or filling out forms, when you have to fill in a form and you have to tick that other box and then explain yourself, that experience to go through that is a challenging personal identity experience. But I think you are right, there is this idea that concentrate on the whiter parts culturally, because that's the known. And also, I don't think that's done out of malice. I think it's the unknown. You don't want to offend, you don't want to upset, you don't want to misinterpret. So I think people tend to avoid rather than talk about it or challenge, because it is unknown. But you're absolutely right. I think that's a really succinct way that you've put it.
I would totally agree with the points you've made. You know, being mixed race, there was a tendency just to focus on the familiar. And again, I suppose understandable, you focus on what's familiar and what's known to you. But it does mean, and for me too, there were no other Arabs that I knew in the school. So my kind of heritage there wasn't anyone I could kind of share or explore that with. So the cultural connections I made came through the religious commonalities I had with other pupils from different backgrounds. But yeah, I would agree with both of you there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So you mentioned there a wee bit about role models and how important it is for children to see themselves in the teachers that work with them. So we're going to move forward a wee bit and talk about the teaching profession and how you entered the teaching profession. So I wonder, Jahan, could I start with you? What attracted you to the teaching profession?
Yeah, there was a mixture of personal and professional reasons, but I'll focus on the professional really. I had been an academic previously, and I'd always really enjoyed the interactions I'd had with my pupils in the university setting. And so when I was, for various reasons, thinking about a different career, I was drawn to teaching because I really enjoyed the teaching part of being an academic, which you often found very little time for, with the emphasis on research. And I had also felt, having been an academic specialising in Islam and the Middle East, and particularly history of the Middle East, that I never heard or read a thing about the Middle East until I decided to study a course on it at university. So it was so much later in my education that I even came into contact with that part of the world and the history and politics of the region. So I actually felt that with my background, I was bringing that different perspective to teaching, and that was something that unique that I could offer. And I've entered teaching in Scotland at a really interesting moment. I joined, I did the MSc in Transformative Learning and Teaching at the University of Edinburgh. And that was a course that clearly was looking and is part of this project to diversify the teaching profession. So I was definitely seen as somebody who could definitely bring that to teaching. So I've certainly benefited from that focus. And the program itself, and we've been talking about how important IT is in terms of developing that racial awareness and culturally responsive pedagogy, and that was such a central theme throughout the 2 years at the TLT, where I was really, for the first time in my life, really encouraged to reflect on my identity and my background and my heritage, and how I can wrap that around my professional identity and make it relevant. So quite fortunate, I think, and I really enjoyed that time, space to reflect and think about that more, and to also practice it going into placements and bringing my whole self. So, and that's really stayed with me. I'm not, whereas before I may not have mentioned my religious identity or where I come from, I'm very open about that with my pupils, and I talk about that, and that then encourages my pupils to share and talk about the different languages they speak at home, and, to really start just making that an everyday relevance rather than it just being, like we were saying earlier, tokenistic, focusing on key moments and that. So, I've entered teaching in Scotland at an interesting moment where that shift is evident, but really also conscious of the need to really make sure that this is something that's really maintained and embedded, or like I was talking about earlier, you know, this kind of thing was happening in London 30 years ago, and you can still see that not a lot has changed.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think we've got a colleague who wants to come in. Is it Tapua? I think you're on mute.
Okay, thank you.
There we go.
Where to start? Because I think my background will help. I was born in Rhodesia, so I have the experience of living in an apartheid type system. As a child, I went to a Black-only school, and we were just so aware that there's another community out there. And as children, we didn't realize how differently we were treated. But after independence, when there was encouragement for children to mix, it was a difficult time because the law was saying one thing, but in practice, it was difficult to execute whatever the law needed to say. So, for example, I found myself, although I'd applied to go to Black-only schools because I felt more comfortable going to Black-only schools and learning with my mates, the government decided, like almost the American style, to bus us into communities so that we were all mixed up. And it was hard because there was microaggression from pupils of other races and other backgrounds. And it was difficult to survive in there, particularly because I had known what it was like to be with my own people and not to suffer the aggression. So it was really, really difficult. And I worried when my nephew came into this country from a situation where he was accepted to a situation where he had to learn about his race. It was only when I came to this country, after having worked my way and avoided situations where I could be racialized, I was faced with it. My very first class, because I teach English, my very first class in London, the children refused to be taught by me. They explained to me that they don't understand how someone can come from Africa to teach us English. And they politely asked to sit in my class whilst they went to the head of English to discuss this. The head of English had to come into the class with the pupils and explain to them why I was there. And she bluntly said to them, if you know anyone else who's as qualified or better, let them apply for the post. And they were taken aback by that. And they were told a time span. They were told there's another post open. If you get anybody, feel free to recommend. But then the politics of the workplace, particularly, it's hard to teach children who do not respect you and respect your culture. So what I was faced with was a situation where parents would move kids out of school for a week, bring the kids back and say, Miss So-and-so's class is way ahead. Can my child join this class? And when the school became aware that there was this move of kids that was going on, they put their foot down and they were really supportive. Because I had parents' evening, I was told, because we were in a hall, we would all sit in a hall, all teachers would sit in a hall, and I was told, if you see the head of the school coming towards you, those parents have been causing problems. And it would be confrontational. Fortunately, with the way that I structured my lessons, I would always have the learning intention on the board. I would require all the children to have it. So some of those pupils who were not interested would not cooperate. So when they turned up with their parents on parents' evening, I'd have pupils' work that's been completed and done versus this child's work that has not been done, besides all the other follow-ups that you've had to do in terms of writing to parents to try to engage. Of course, they wouldn't respond because they don't respect you. So it was only at that point, and it was only after staying in the school for a while, when you begin to have results, that you start gaining the respect. But you always get one or two who do not want their child to be taught English by a non-English speaker, especially a black one. So it was as blatantly as that. But I moved from England to Scotland in 2009, and I felt like I'd come to paradise. Yes. Because firstly, the school that I joined had an older type staff who understood the history of the British history and the colonies. Some of them had been there. Some of them had relations who were there. So there was that background of understanding where I was coming from and understanding, for example, they were not questioning my qualifications. Whereas in England, they were asking about my qualifications. The parents were asking. But you also now begin, because I had an old admin that understood where I came from, they would understand that some of the questions that were asked about what I was doing in class, they understood the origins of it, and we were able, together with admin, to deal with and reassure parents. Because understandably, parents will worry, because the image that is out there about Black Africans and competence is negative. What they see in the media is negative. But when the school admin changed and we had new admin with younger people, younger staff, first appointment to headship, first appointment to line manager, first appointment to department, the understanding changed because they did not understand where the questioning was coming from. So, for example, instead of working with the teacher to resolve the problems, there was almost an us and them situation that was created, and a failure to understand that if you're taking a person who's occupying an unusual position for that race, according to the audience, you need to support them. The questions that were raised were, I feel, were too much for them to handle because they couldn't understand what was happening. They'd come and observe lessons. The lessons are fine. The check marking, it's fine. But there's always this undercurrents of acceptance by the audience. So that's where the challenge is. I loved teaching in Scotland because the principles and the direction is clearly inclusive. It's the practice that's the challenge.
Thank you so much. That was really a fantastic perspective to share with us. And I think there was so much within what you've said that we could spend the whole rest of the hour talking about experience because there was so much richness there. So thank you very much indeed for sharing that. And I think there's a lot of important aspects about leadership that you mentioned there at the end as well, which hopefully we'll come to later on in our discussion. So thank you very much indeed for sharing that. I wonder if we could look a wee bit more now at what you attracted you to the teaching profession in terms of our panellists, but also some of the barriers that you might have faced in terms of entering the profession. So Nuzat, could I come to you next? So what attracted you first to teaching and what barriers did you find, or if you did find any barriers?
So my original career after I graduated was in marketing. I worked in retail banking and finance for a number of years. But when I had my second daughter, she was my second child, I've got a son first, I don't know, I got really interested in reading about early child development during my pregnancy, and I just got really hooked. And having had one child and then kind of comparing my second experience, I just got really, really interested in how little brains work and the whole kind of development idea. So at that point, I had actually been supporting my husband through his PhD over 5 years. When he completed it, I decided, right, it's my turn and I want to go for a change. So I actually went back to college to do the HND in early education and childcare, and then I worked in nurseries for a couple of years. And I just loved, I have to say, just that first time when a child experiences something, when that first time the connection is made, I just found that so fascinating, and to be there and to be part of that. So that really, I really, really enjoyed that aspect. And, but I myself also just got such a bug for learning, having gone back into education. I think after about 14 years, I thought, gosh, I really like this. And it's funny, of course, because the HND, there were my group of friends that I had during the college year. One of them was, she said, oh, I was 8 that year you got married. And I'm like, right, so they were a whole load younger than me, but I absolutely loved it. And I thought, you know what, I want to go further in this. And that's when then after a couple of years, I registered for the PGDE. And I thought, right, it's one more year, I'll do it. And, I've absolutely loved being a primary teacher for lots of different reasons. So that's kind of why I've come into it. But I think coming into it at an older age as well brings a very different perspective, because you've had certain experiences of the world around you. And I think you're so much more politically aware as well. You've been through the job market, you've seen how that kind of outside world works in that way. And then coming as a parent as well, I was aware of the experiences my children were having. Not that they've had anything in particularly bad experiences, but, I felt like I wanted to be more part of that. And if I can bring about change, then that's what really motivates me. And I think the experiences we've talked about that we had in school, and that idea of hiding, not consciously all the time, but just automatically you hide that other aspect of your identity. I thought, the age I was at, I thought, well, I don't need to hide that. So I've gone from never using henna because I was embarrassed about it, to now doing it with my pupils in a classroom. It's a whole different process. And that in itself I find really empowering, because that shows me that as a teacher I have, that power. We do have that power to make change right there and then in the classroom. So that's something that definitely keeps motivating me.
Fantastic, thanks very much. I think that's a really interesting dimension as well. When you come into it later on in life with different confidences and abilities, I think that's a really interesting point to how that shapes your identity as a teacher as well. Elizabeth, what about you? What attracted you to teaching, and what barriers, if any, have you faced?
So I think the first thing I should probably say is I never dreamed of becoming a teacher. It was not on the radar for me as a child. I didn't have my teddies lined up, teaching them with a chalkboard or anything like that. And I think the relevance of saying that is that for me, coming from an Asian background, and a bit more context, well, my dad was born in Cowdenbeath. He never actually grew up there. He grew up in Singapore. So neither of my parents have been through the Scottish education system. I don't know if any other people who have an Asian background here would assimilate with what I'm saying, but teaching is not necessarily seen as a profession in Asia. It's not considered in my family growing up something that would be professional or a route to go down, or something that's going to make you lots of money. As a child, the kind of frameworks that I was given, I guess it was my first barrier to teaching, is that there was an expectation that I would go into some kind of medicine. A lawyer would be good, but my higher guidance teacher said that probably wasn't on the radar for me, given the hires that I was going to receive from high school. So I never went into teaching. I actually ended up doing an undergraduate degree in sociology, and it was during that degree that I saw the importance of education as part of a social superstructure, and the societal challenges that we have in contemporary society, looking at challenges like globalization, the impact of that, migration, and how challenging it is for global migration and people who do migrate or come from different backgrounds, and the challenges they face, the difficulties they have, the systemic racism that exists in society. And so I think for me, that was my first kind of taster of it, that I wanted to do something for social change. However, after graduating from university, then another barrier, you need to make money. My parents didn't really see education as something that would be favourable for me, so I chose not to and went into asset management. And it was only while I was doing that one of my friends who had founded the Secret Garden outdoor nursery, it was the first outdoor nursery in Scotland, she asked if, because we were having a dialogue about it one night, and she asked if I wanted to come along and help out. So at this point I decided I was applying for my PGDE, so I got my application in, and it was during that time at the outdoor nursery that I saw the importance of education in terms of changing the trajectory of society. I know that sounds a bit grandiose, but That is what we do as educators and what we do as an educational system. So there was probably a lot of pie in the sky at that point for me. And then I decided to go into my PGDE, which I think my parents thought was maybe slightly more favourable because it was seen as like a postgraduate. And now they've like fully embraced, now that I have a master's in education, they've fully embraced that education is a respectable profession. But I think there's a disparity between the East and the West and how different communities view education and value educators. So yeah, that was kind of my journey into education. And the barriers that I had came from my family and my ethnic background, and they've always been super supportive. I'm not here to downplay my mum and dad, but that culturally there was a barrier there for me. And I know that's something that's been picked up on in the Teaching in Diverse Scotland documentation as well. It's recognised that there are these barriers for encouraging people into initial teacher education, and it's how do we as a teaching community overcome that, which is one of our big barriers to look at.
Absolutely. So if we now move on to thinking about once you're in the profession, one of the big issues, like you say, Elizabeth, that was mentioned in the Teaching in Diverse Scotland report was about retention of teachers from BAME communities. So I wonder, Jahan, have you got any thoughts around how best basically we can support teachers from BAME communities to stay in the profession, to thrive in the profession?
Yeah, and I'd spoken earlier that positive entry I'd had through the ITE program, and I was kind of aware that I'd be going from this kind of very safe place and haven where I was encouraged to bring all my full self to play and to be proud of that and to work with that, and then you leave that safe space of the university and you go out into the rest of the world, and it's tricky because you're still finding yourself in environments where I've definitely experienced the struggle to pronounce my name, and some teachers that just never learnt to say my name, whereas pupils have always found that much easier for some reason. And just the absence of those kind of conversations, even in a lot of school settings still, of just you suddenly go from that university environment to it being just the norm, and you're not really encouraged to explore that aspect of yourself. But at the same time, and again, depending on your setting, I have had the autonomy to bring that unique experience of mine into the classroom, and I've definitely been doing that over the past 2 years with really interesting results. And it's always fascinating, the parents' response. So I've kind of widened a topic that we do in P7 on World War II to look at conflict as a concept, and then based on my pupils' backgrounds, explore conflicts that are relevant to them. So like the India-Pakistan, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then when I've had responses from parents, they've just been really happy about that and have talked about me broadening their pupils' horizons and getting them to think beyond their immediate environment. And so that response has been really great, because sometimes you could worry that, that you maybe wouldn't get such a positive response or be questioning the relevance of these. And although I'd be prepared to defend it, but actually, no, I've had really positive responses from parents to that. However, in terms of retaining BAME teachers, I very nearly fell out of the profession last year. I struggled to get a job. I'd started applying for other jobs. I was really, really just upset at the whole situation where, I had all this experience and I'd had a great probation year and I'd had excellent references from my head teachers and couldn't seem to get to interview stage even. So not even having the opportunity to share and talk. And then even finding actually when you do get to interview stage, that the nature of the questions really don't invite you or ask you to bring any of that previous experience. It's all about, very narrow questions about, tell me about a good lesson you've done and what, very, again, in terms of trying to, giving BAME teachers that opportunity to really express and talk about their experiences and the relevance of those experiences to teaching, because that's a really crucial point. I didn't really find that in the interview experiences I had. So, yeah, I mean, even from, I think there's still a need, and I was reading, you know, in terms of the second report that Rowena put out on how we're doing. And there was a letter sent out to local authorities asking them what they're doing to try and recruit, attract and retain BAME teachers. And the council I currently work for hasn't replied to that letter, which says a lot about the structural approach to that issue where I'm working now. It really does come down to, and again, I've ended up in the role I've had because of one person and an individual who did see what I would bring and who gave me an opportunity that I totally ran with. So it's still very much up to individuals within the system who see the unique qualities that BAME teachers bring and who give them an opportunity to show that and to develop. But I don't think that there's still a systematic approach to recruiting and retaining BAME teachers.
Absolutely. I think that's a very common issue across the system. Nusa, you've done a lot of work in your various different roles in the system. What do you see as some of the ways that we can support BAME teachers to stay in teaching and to thrive and to move forward in their careers?
I think there needs to be a shift in how we think about this, in the idea of supporting BAME teachers. I think if we keep focusing on what do BAME teachers need as such, not that it's wrong, but I think it takes away the responsibility that lies on the rest of the workforce. And what I mean by that is what we need more than anything is for everyone else to become racially literate and develop a certain level of cultural competence as well to go with that. So for example, Jahan was talking about conflict there. A very current issue obviously is around what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And I know of schools that have been flying Ukrainian flags. And, we talked previously about, not bringing politics into school. But I'm not saying that's wrong. But what's wrong is when we choose which flags we want to fly and which flags we don't fly. So either we are bringing politics into school or we are not bringing politics into school. Do you know what I mean? So if you are an ethnic minority teacher who has a background connected to certain areas of conflict, I know last year when the Israel-Palestine issue was flaring up again, there were children who were being sent home for coming in a Palestinian scarf, children trying to fundraise for Palestine, and that was being discouraged in various places. So we can't have this kind of double standards, because then as a teacher of an ethnic minority, you automatically now start to feel othered. You realize actually your perspective and your feelings in certain areas are not being respected. They're not going to be valued, so you don't speak up. And it's that kind of frustration that can build up for colleagues where they think, I'm out of here. And so that again, it's not their responsibility. It's not about supporting them. It's about educating everyone else about how they need to approach these things and what the needs are. Also, in relation to that, then is we've had a number of webinars across different platforms over the last year or so around anti-racism. And what I found is most of the people that will go to them are ethnic minority teachers. So I'm sitting there looking at maybe the same people again and again, and I'm thinking, we know this. Not that we are all experts, but, again, it's not us that generally that need that education. So what are we doing to promote these events more to, our white majority colleagues? Because they're the ones that need to come on board more as well. Also, in terms of interviews that was mentioned. So one of the pieces of work I've been doing with Glasgow City Council on behalf of the EIS Glasgow BAME network is that I've initiated a program where we've developed a pool of ethnic minority teachers in Glasgow who were trained up as part of the recruitment and selection process so that we could also sit on interview panels. So it didn't matter what your pay grade was for you to sit on an interview panel, for example, for support for learning workers or for, supply teachers maybe coming into the council. But the importance of that was One, it gave BAME colleagues in the council that experience of sitting on the other side of the table. That, in that sense of professional development, was really, really, valuable. So you're also understanding what the process is, the scoring process, having that professional discussion around, who is most suitable in terms of the, the post that you've interviewed for. But it's also about increasing representation for everybody else. So it's about all those other people on the panels to know that you exist and you can also do these jobs. And of course, for the candidates that come to the interview. So there's a lot of, value, I think, in that. So it's really, again, about how, the development of everyone else is really important in this process, because as a minority, I think whatever minority you're part of, whether you're LGBT or you have a disability, minorities by definition will always have an uphill battle, right? We will always be fighting because by definition, you're in the minority. Change only happens when the majority get on board. And we've seen that kind of change start to happen in terms of LGBT recognition and the development of the education kind of framework in that area, because the majority have got on board to start supporting it and pushing it and being educated towards it. So I think in terms of support for us, that's what we really need. We need everyone else to really pull up their socks and learn, to help everyone move forward.
I think that's an absolutely crucial point, and I think it's something that I'm seeing a lot of in the system currently, particularly as we make the move to anti-racist approaches to education. I think the danger is we have an over-reliance on asking BAME colleagues what should we do about it, when actually the work of anti-racism is a white person's piece of work to do. So I guess the question is, how do we get that balance right of listening to the experiences of our BAME colleagues and honouring the experiences they've gone through, whilst not relying on them, solely or overly to provide the answers. I think that's one of the things that we have to really work on over the next couple of years, is how do we get that balance right so that we do listen to people and we do get diverse perspectives, but we also don't over-rely and put the responsibility on those colleagues to do that. So thank you very much for raising that point. Elizabeth, do you want to say anything regarding that?
No, I just think you've made a really valid point there, Kevin, that often it does fall on the shoulders of people from diverse backgrounds in schools, or colleagues from multiple ethnic backgrounds, that we're the ones that then look to do the staff development, or we kind of push it further up on the agenda because it's so relevant to us. But you're absolutely right that this should be on everybody's agenda. I think in terms of teacher retention for teachers from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, one of the biggest things is all the work that's going on around decolonising the curriculum, and being able to deliver a curriculum that you feel is culturally appropriate for today's society is going to make a huge impact for practitioners. And that is your bread and butter. That is what you're teaching every single day. So I think if the actual content of the profession that we're carrying out is more culturally responsive and it's actively anti-racist, then that's something that teachers will engage with more, teachers from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. It's almost like you've seen a tangible change that you're delivering in the classroom. The other thing I think will have a huge impact for teacher retention is developing racial literacy amongst staff. And I know that my colleagues here have picked up on it, that our staff need to be much more confident in having those dialogues and knowing that those dialogues are okay to have, and not fearing them. I myself have never encountered people being actively racist or actively avoiding those conversations, but definitely being uncomfortable around those situations. And I think it's something that practitioners at all levels need to be much more confident having those dialogues. So I think that would definitely help with teacher retention as well. And I guess the biggest thing is a long-term trajectory. Children from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds who are potentially the teachers from the future, they can imagine themselves being a teacher if they can't see themselves as a teacher now. I think it was Dr. Arsad who wrote that in one of her Teaching in Diverse Scotland documents, that if our children now who come from diverse backgrounds can't see themselves represented in their teachers and all of the practitioners at all levels, then they can't imagine themselves as that. It makes it much more difficult. So that's a huge barrier for children.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So we're now going to move on and think about how best to attract, support and retain leaders from BAME communities. So anybody who has read the Teaching in Diverse Scotland report will see that there is an absolutely staggering lack of BAME representation and leadership in schools in Scotland. And I think at one point, I think it's changed in the very recent past, but at one point there was no Black or minority ethnic head teachers in Scotland at all. So I'm not putting anybody in the panel on the spot about their own leadership aspirations or what they might be thinking doing themselves, but I'm really just asking more generally, do you think there's work to be done in terms of making that role more visible, more attractive? What is it about headship or leadership, or what barriers are there in the place of people who are interested in those sort of roles from BAME communities? Jahan, can we start with you first?
I think it somehow is about there being opportunities for career progression, and that not just that BAME teachers actually view it as a path. And I think part of it is, if you have never worked with a leader that looks like you, again, you just don't see yourself in that role. And then you're also working in a system that, has this unconscious bias. And so if you were to put yourself forward for promotion, you'd likely get overlooked without people even really realizing. So there's definitely needs to be work done to shift attitudes and to some positive action too, that I think has been taking place in Glasgow, to actually get, because you're not going to get people to be head teachers if they've not gone through the PT role and deputy and so on. So there has to be that work done at every step of the way to start moving promotion in that direction, where you've got more BAME teachers starting to make that progression. But I think there's that positive action is one way to at least get the ball rolling and to get more diversity visible, and so people start to think about themselves in those positions, and mentoring within BAME communities. SAMI and the work that they do is fantastic. We're creating a network of BAME educators who have safe places to share, but also to help develop themselves and to think and reflect about their career progression, and to have that support there. Because when you are going for these roles that are really challenging, and you that supportive kind of network there, and advice that's available is also really important at helping to get the ball rolling in that regard.
Absolutely. And I think that point you made there at the start, Jahan, about the pipeline and about how we work further upstream to make sure that we do that work with folk earlier in their career and before they get into those promoted post link is so key. Thank you very much for that. Elizabeth, in terms of leadership and supporting colleagues from BAME communities to access leadership roles, is there anything that you think we could be doing differently that would help that?
I think, again, just to reiterate that if you can't see yourself, if you've never seen yourself in a role like that, it's hard to imagine yourself in that role. I think for me, I shouldn't shoot myself in the foot because I know there's people from my authority here, but I don't necessarily aspire to go into a management role within a school. And I think it's a really relevant point, because it's difficult to be aware of the other areas for promotion and progression within the education system, especially for people who haven't come through the Scottish education themselves or have family who've experienced it. So you don't necessarily know all of the tiers of education, the other outlying areas that contribute to a school on its own. Looking at things like the General Teaching Council, universities, IT providers, there are so many facets to education that I think if you haven't been through it yourself, it is difficult to know where those different avenues are for progression. So I think that's a big barrier as well. If you're culturally haven't experienced it or have a sound understanding of the whole model of education in Scotland, it then makes it difficult to imagine routes for yourself for progression. And that's another barrier, is coming to understand that.
Absolutely. And I think that picture being painted for you or with you is so important as well, because like you say, if you don't know how the system works, and I think the Scottish education system can be very insular and is very small scale, and everyone knows everyone, and there's a whole kind of network there that it's hard to crack into. So I think it's really, really important that we sponsor and mentor colleagues to do that. Thank you very much. Nusa, have you got any thoughts around the leadership aspect and what could be done better?
Yeah, so I think on last count, from what I know, we have 4 BAME head teachers in the whole of Scotland. I believe 1 is either Edinburgh or Fife, and 3 in South Lanarkshire. So I don't know what South Lanarkshire have been doing, but there you go. Jahan was mentioning, in Glasgow, I've also been involved in these positive action measures. So what happened last year is that the council ring-fenced 5 acting PT posts, and they were open to all ethnic minority teachers in Glasgow across the different sectors, nursery, primary and secondary. So they were filled. However, I think the potential is that they want to repeat the exercise, which is great for this year. Currently, I am in the process of gathering data from BAME teachers in Glasgow around what that experience meant for them. I've got the theme. The themes so far that are coming through are very much around, again, this lack of understanding, the idea that I never applied because I didn't want other colleagues to say, oh, why are you going for that? How come I can't go for it? That lack of understanding of why we need to make these changes and that there is a problem there. I think in Glasgow, for example, we don't have any even deputy head teachers, let alone head teachers that are from an ethnic minority. So I've had discussions in the past with white colleagues who had absolutely no idea. Everyone just assumes, oh, there must be. So again, there needs to be a lot of work done still to raise awareness of where we actually are and how dire actually the situation is. People just don't realize, because of course it doesn't affect them. So they're not maybe as bothered. But we need to make people understand the benefits of having a diverse workforce, and therefore this is a bad thing if we don't have any deputy head teachers. So that pipeline aspect is going to take years. So one of the things I've suggested is, can we look at doing something for PTs going into deputy positions, who have that aspiration? Is there any other way we can do that kind of thing? And it could even be something like, instead of just acting positions, maybe creating a space where more people can shadow existing members of management, so that at least they can start to develop that side of their experience. They can write that on their CV. They can take part in more leadership courses. So like Jahan said, Sammy's course is really great. The EIS do a specific one for BAME, and I think some councils also do BAME specific leadership courses. And they all really help you to raise your confidence, because you're in that space with people who have similar experiences. So you can share those experiences and support each other, and that becomes a good kind of support network. So that's really useful, because you need to have that, when you go for these positions, to say, well, have you done any leadership training and things like that? I mean, sadly, I know that there are still head teachers out there, though, that maybe don't fully appreciate, again, the need for this work. And, I know of a colleague who wasn't able to go on a certain course because their head teacher said to them, oh, that's got nothing to do with teaching and learning. And when you think about it, it's all to do with teaching and learning. If we have that diversity in our school leaders and our management in various positions, that is going to enhance teaching and learning. So again, it's about educating everyone to understand why that work is needed. So I think we need to really think outside the box. The positive action measures are good because it's about trying to start to level the playing field, and it does require drastic action, but it needs a lot of building of solidarity and understanding for it to really happen. But I do think we need to think outside the box. So other ways of, how can someone in that position be able to develop those skills without necessarily always applying and then being rejected for the job. And the other thing about interviews as well is feedback is hugely important. I went for a role once, which I didn't get, and it was the head teacher that had phoned me back, and her feedback was, oh, you could have smiled more. And I thought, okay, well, how am I supposed to now take that back to develop? So feedback, I think we need to be really, really strict about the kind of feedback. And the thing I say to colleagues now is you ask for that feedback and, you push for it. You absolutely need that feedback and you question it. So how do what should I now do to develop that? I mean, am I supposed to look in the mirror and keep smiling, to practice my smile? That's not going to help me be a PT or a head teacher or whatever. So I think feedback is really important because it is so inconsistent. Even within councils of the same, it's just so inconsistent because, interviews and the whole recruitment process, I think it's just not transparent enough still. I think there's still too much space for individual bias. So you can give them all anti-racist training, but how do you counter for the fact that, how they say somebody will make up a decision about you in the first 90 seconds that you walk into a room or you come up on their screen nowadays, and you will tend to want to go for people who you think will fit better in your school. What does that fit better mean? That will depend on what the priorities of your school are. If you're wanting to develop an anti-racist ethos, you're wanting to develop an ethos of social justice, then that's the kind of people you're looking for. And that will be people with all different experiences. But if you just want someone who's going to fit in well and be able to go out for drinks at the end of term, that might not be me, for example. So I think there's still a lot of work to think about how we can challenge these kind of issues.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really key point about the type of professional learning or training that white leaders need. And I think one of the barriers we've talked about in some of the work we've done at university is, the sort of cookie cutter standard diversity, equality and inclusion training doesn't cut it. And I think that is one of the kind of barriers that we've got, is we need that out of the box thinking that you mentioned there, Nusa, about the types of professional learning that are actually going to make a difference and really change mindsets of the folk who've got the power and the folk who are doing the recruiting and who are on the selection panels. So thank you very much for mentioning that. Khadija, you were talking there in the chat about how complex a lot of these issues are. Do you want to say anything about the complexity of these issues or any part of this aspect around leadership?
You've put me on the spot now, Kevin. I was thinking, what did I put in the chat? I think it was regarding what Nuzat was talking about around teachers and the opportunities that they get in terms of even the positive action. The things that you've raised are really important, and I think we can't stress them enough, that what we've got to really remember is any such action that we take, there will be misunderstandings on both counts. So BAME teachers misunderstand that because they think, well, gosh, no, I don't want a leg up. Yeah, I want to get there on my own merit. So this whole debate on meritocracy starts to come to the fore. But then there's also that aspect of the pushback that they're going to receive from their fellow colleagues, like Nuzat spoke about in the staff room, like, how come you get to apply for that and I don't? And I think that when Glasgow did release those posts, I think there should have been some groundwork done beforehand to prepare both our BAME teachers, but also the majority, I think, white teachers about why this is happening. So yeah, there's complexity there, Kevin, because quite often, and it's back to that point, and I'm reminded of, and I put it in the chat, Ruxana, she's here today. Ruxana wrote a fantastic blog and shared it, and in that was just so typical of what many BAME teachers experience. So back to your own schooling that you started off this conversation with, but also then your ITE education there, not having the chance to explore your identity, your racial identity development. And then when you go into school, what the majority of BAME teachers do is try to fit in. So what we're effectively doing is playing white, right? For fear of the implications of being different or being perceived to be different. And so therefore, we don't recognise that our culture, our language, perhaps our religion, actually would have a powerful part to play in the culture responsive pedagogies that my colleagues have been talking about here. And so we tend not to, we tend to kind of leave them as well and don't think it's important. So there are real issues there about the support of creating safer, braver spaces, I guess, for leaders to recognise the added wealth, that community cultural wealth that BAME teachers bring with them, but also helping BAME teachers to recognise that in themselves. Because from Ruxana's blog, I could certainly feel, Ruxana, the frustration. Why didn't somebody tell me this before? Why didn't I think that I could code switch and use my Urdu or my Punjabi in the classroom? Why didn't I feel comfortable doing that right from the get-go? So we've got a lot of complex issues there, Kevin. And again, I could go on for ages, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing those issues to the fore, and sorry for putting you on the spot, but I knew you'd have a good perspective to share with us. Now, we've got about 10 minutes left of our conversation this afternoon. So if you've got a burning question that you want to ask the panel, or you've got something you really want to say that you've not the chance to say, please do stick up your hands before we wrap up our conversation. But I just wanted to finish with the panel to really focus on one thing that really came to mind for me when I was looking at your bios and putting together some of the information for this evening. All three of you have got many things in common, but one of the things you really share is a really strong commitment to professional learning. So I know, for example, you've done master's level learning and obviously your doctoral study as well, Jahan. So I wondered if you wanted to say anything about the role that professional learning has played in building your confidence and building your identity as a teacher. Elizabeth, could we start with you? Because we've just done a recent interview, Elizabeth and I, about our master's programme, and she was absolutely brilliant. So I wanted to give you the chance to share some of your thinking about the importance of professional learning to you.
It has been so important to me. When I first went into education, I didn't recognise my ethnicity as something that could even be valued. And I think as well, because I'd like to think of myself as quite interculturally competent. I'm quite fluid in my cultural identity, and from a young age I've learned to switch between the two. So I've very much played white all the way through my further education and my initial teacher education as well. Then when you go into school, I work in rural Fife, so I'm in very rural schools. Only until last year, I'd never actually had a colleague who had come from an ethnically diverse background. I've always been the only member of staff who would identify as ethnically diverse. And as of last year, I now have a colleague in my school who also identifies as ethnically diverse. So again, plain white, really good at it because I've done it for so long and just never recognised that that's what I was doing until I did my MEd in Leadership and Learning through Edinburgh University. I initially got some funding from Fife Council to do the first module, and then after that I self-funded, and Zoe Robertson kindly found me some funding as well to finish my Masters. And that was a huge turning point for me. It flipped my entire understanding of my role as an educator, and how my own ethnic identity acts as part of that role. It's made me the teacher that I am today, and it's also put me down this avenue of research as well that I'm hugely passionate about, and I understand the impact that I can potentially make in a classroom. And if it hadn't been for the guidance of the MEd and the support of the MEd to look at that as an avenue of research, I absolutely would not be where I am today in my own understanding of my role as an educator, of my ethnicity, and to be able to then lead skill development on that as well, and cluster level development too. So I feel that MEd in Leadership and Learning gave me the confidence. It helped me recognise who I am as a person. And for me, my ethnicity is part of me as a person, and it's definitely now part of my role as an educator. So I'm eternally grateful to the support of Edinburgh University on the MEd. Without further education, I wouldn't have been able to even consider myself as an ethnically diverse educator and feel that I can help promote that amongst fellow colleagues and hopefully make an impact in our field. So yeah, further education is so important to all educators, whatever your background.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And Zoe's popped into the chat there a link to Elizabeth's blog that she wrote about some of the research that she did when she was on the MEd programme. Jahan, do you want to talk about the role that professional learning has played in your building your identity and your confidence as a teacher?
Yeah, just like Elizabeth, I'm just looking at my record of professional learning over the last couple of years, and I've done so much professional learning on anti-racist education, decolonising the curriculum, culturally responsive pedagogy, developing anti-racist policy. It's such a big part of my professional learning at the moment, and it is a bit of a safe place too, because I similarly work in a setting where I'm the only one who's of a diverse background, and you sort of feel like you're doing this work on your own. And so to have the opportunity at sessions like this even to really talk about these things, but Len, I think Khadija, you made a good point earlier that BAME educators aren't necessarily also anti-racist. Like, there is work that we have to do too, and that's what I've been doing to really get my own understanding of key concepts and pedagogical approaches and develop. Just being BAME doesn't qualify you to be an expert in this. You definitely bring experiences, but knowledge and know-how is something that you can always be developing, and it's absolutely helped me to develop and enhance my knowledge and also my practice and and just one thing I want to say from that, a lot of the courses I've done have tended to be provided either by organisations in Glasgow or in Edinburgh. And that's another point I just wanted to make earlier. There's the national approach to anti-racism still seems to not really be there. Like, the big cities are doing this work at the moment, and they tend to be the ones that also have quite a lot of diversity. But when you come out of the cities, I'm in Falkirk at the moment, and I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm about to move to Edinburgh, where this work isn't happening in the same way. And there's this attitude that if you're not diverse, then there isn't that problem here. We don't have a problem here because we're all white. And actually, education is about preparing our young people for the world. All right. So if there isn't that diversity in the school, it doesn't actually matter. You're preparing them to live in a very global community. And that attitudinal shift, I think, still needs to take place there, so that we all realise, wherever we are, whether we've got diversity in our midst or not, we need to be doing this work. I went off on a tangent, but I think that was a really, I think that's also come out in the second report from Marina too, that there's areas where it's just saying, this isn't really relevant to us at the moment.
Absolutely, I think that's a really key point, that I think a lot of particularly rural, as you say, locations in Scotland don't see it as something that's relevant to them, which is obviously absolutely incorrect. So thank you very much for sharing that. Nuzat, do you want to reflect on how professional learning has played a role in building your identity and confidence?
I would have to say it's been absolutely vital to me, especially in the last couple of years. When we went into lockdown, I had already started developing this kind of specialism in global citizenship education, and I completed that during lockdown, and it really pushed me to kind of reflect on my practice in terms of how I teach and what I teach in a kind of citizenship lens itself. The kind of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement then obviously threw up this whole aspect of anti-racism even more. So even though myself as a teacher, I can bring my cultural experiences to the classroom like we've talked about, at that point, I really realized, well, just me doing it isn't going to be enough to bring about the kind of changes that actually our young people then started to talk about. So for me, similarly to Jahan, I thought, well, I want to learn more about what other people are doing, what other people are saying. I made a comment on Twitter about I had been upon my reading, I had come across the fact that a lot of ethnic minority students are disadvantaged when it comes to predicted grades in high school. So I had made a comment about that, and Henry Hepburn from Test Scotland contacted me and said, "You want to write a blog?" And that's the very first time I've ever written an article. And again, I got such a bug for it. I've written lots of different things now since then, but that was my first one, where I wasn't necessarily sharing my opinion or my experience, but I was sharing the research that I was coming across and the fact that it was actually really shocking, and people need to understand that this is a problem that exists. And if you're a teacher that says, "Oh, but I'm not racist," and I wouldn't mark somebody down because of that, it's not that simple. It's about understanding the whole system that we are all a part of, and the fact that you as a teacher are also a product of the same education system in a lot of cases. So how do you distance yourself from that to make sure that you are, that biases, again, are not part of that process. So for my professional learning, then, it's very much been about connecting. And I was saying earlier, wasn't I, Kevin, about how I think this opportunity we've had now for virtual connection and online events has really opened up the world, I think, for us as teachers. And when I say world, I mean even it's opened up Scotland. We didn't have access to each other even within the country in the way that we do now, let alone are now also connecting with global educators on, on a whole different level. So I've really enjoyed that aspect of developing my networks and my professional identity within these areas. My own network that I've set up now, the Global Citizenship Network, is Scotland-wide. I've got around 300 teachers, school leaders on that, and we come together for various events and discuss best practice and do some CPD and things. And I think it's just absolutely invaluable. I think this is an exciting time in that sense to be a teacher, where we can learn so much from each other. And like, I was touching on earlier, I have certain experiences as an ethnic minority, but, I'm still keen to learn more specifically about the experiences of my other, fellow ethnic minority people from different backgrounds. Like we were talking about the mixed race. That's not my experience. So I'm keen to know, how does this affect you? Because ultimately, as a teacher, I need to be open to these things. So I need to understand the life that my children in front of me are leading, and how these things affect them. The idea that, for teachers to say, oh, I don't see colour and I treat everyone the same, from my own development and all the reading, and if you really look into things like the Equalities Act and the UNCRC, which is now becoming embedded for us in Scotland in law, it's not enough to say that I treat everyone the same, because actually that's where the problem lies. You can't treat everyone the same, and you have to see the colour, because when you don't see the colour, which is what our experience was growing up, then you're just assuming what that child wants to learn, and you're assuming that they'll just go along with the majority, and that is where the problem is. So we shouldn't be scared of difference, I guess. I think we've been too scared of highlighting differences as though it's a bad thing. We need to think about all these things as assets, that are going to enhance our educational experience for us as teachers and obviously for pupils. So for me, professional learning has been fantastic over the last couple of years, and I hope that we can continue this type of strong connection that we're developing. And of course, in terms of support as well. So through all the support networks, I've developed the Glasgow BAME network a lot over the last couple of years. We now have a national network in terms of the EIS, through Sami's work. Other unions will be doing their thing as well. Other equality groups that are coming together. So I think all that is really, really important. But I do have a slight kind of frustration, maybe. I still don't think on the ground enough people are understanding the importance of this to teaching and learning. And if, for example, we're going to really follow what our new refreshed standards are encouraging us to do in terms of focusing on social justice, then I think we really need to think about, again, what the purpose of education is. And yes, there's an immense importance on literacy and numeracy, but there's so much more of a responsibility, I think, that we have as teachers and educators to develop that anti-racist, socially just, group of adults for the future, and our world leaders and our country's leaders. We can't just rely on literacy and numeracy for that. So I think we really need to think about how we can incorporate social justice as well as the heart of everything else then that we teach.
Absolutely, and I think that link from what we've talked about tonight to pedagogy and to curriculum, I think, is so important and something that needs to be unpacked and developed more. So that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much to our three panelists this evening who have shared in such rich and vivid terms their own experiences and their own perspectives on being a teacher from a minority community in our system. I think every single one of us have learned a huge amount from listening to you and engaging with you. So we're really, really grateful and appreciative for your time and your expertise tonight. I've dropped into the chat there the Twitter handle for our Teacher Education Partnership and my contact email address. This is just one of the events we're doing as part of a series of events. We have got ideas for future events, but if you want to be involved in future events, or you have ideas for what you think we haven't talked about tonight, or where else we need to take the conversation, we'd really appreciate hearing your opinions on that. So it's great to see so many different people here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And if you want to be involved in future events, please do get in contact with us through email or through Twitter. So thank you once again to our fantastic panelists. Thank you all very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.